Tara Mitchell, 33 years old, a registered nurse working in the ICU at Northwestern Memorial in Chicago. For 5 years, I wired my parents $1,500 every single month. Their rent in Naperville, their electric bill, my mom's rheumatologist co-pays, my dad's blood pressure medication. All of it came out of my paycheck before I ever touched a dime for myself. That's $90,000 over 5 years. I know because I counted it the night everything fell apart. The day I counted it was the day I was lying in a hospital bed, not as a nurse, but as a patient, waiting for emergency surgery on a ruptured ovarian cyst, texting my parents to please come. I was scared, and my mom replied, "We're in Sedona, can't this wait?" They were in Sedona, can't this wait? On a trip I didn't know they'd taken. A trip I later found out they'd paid for partly with the money I sent the month before. My hands were shaking when I read that text. The kind of shaking that isn't just fear, it's recognition. Something you've known for a long time finally forcing itself all the way up to the surface where you can't push it back down anymore. I didn't cry. I put the phone face down on the hospital blanket and made a decision that took me 5 years too long to make. 20 minutes later, my phone was blowing up with calls from my dad. I didn't answer a single one. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without understanding how it started. My parents aren't disabled. They're both in their late 50s, both physically capable of working. My dad at 61 had spent 20 years as a line supervisor at a packaging plant in Joliet before the facility downsized and let him go. That was in 2019. He collected unemployment, then just stopped looking. My mom had worked part-time at a dental office for years, but when her rheumatoid arthritis flared up, and it was real, I'm not dismissing that, she stopped going in and never went back. The arthritis is managed now. Has been for 2 years. She still doesn't work. I understood when it started. I really did. I was 28, brand new to the ICU, making decent money for the first time in my life, and they were struggling. Their mortgage in Naperville had gotten away from them after my dad lost his job. They refinanced badly. I stepped in because I loved them and because it felt temporary. 6 months, I told myself. Maybe a year while my dad found something new. The year became 2, then 3, then 5. Every month, $1,500 transferred on the first. If I was even a day late, my dad would text, "Rent's due." Not, "Hey, are you okay?" Just, "Rent's due." Like I was a utility payment, not his daughter. My brother Weston is 36. He lives 40 minutes from my parents in a 4-bedroom house he bought with his wife 2 years ago. He does very well, project manager at a tech firm. His wife is in pharmaceutical sales. They have a boat. An actual boat they keep at a marina in Waukegan. My parents think he walks on water. My mom has a framed photo of him on her kitchen wall. I am not in any photos on her kitchen wall. I checked once. I stood in that kitchen and looked at every single frame. Not one picture of me. When I brought up, gently, carefully, after about a year of sending money, whether Weston might be able to chip in something, even $300 or $400 a month, my mom's voice got that particular flat tone she uses when she's about to reframe reality. Weston has a family to think about. He has a mortgage. You're single, you have more flexibility. Flexibility. That word still makes my jaw tighten. I was a single woman working night shifts in an ICU, skipping vacations I desperately needed, driving a 2014 Civic with a cracked dashboard, eating meal-prepped rice and chicken every week so I could wire money to parents who were bragging about Weston's boat to their friends. I had flexibility. My friend Audra, she's a paralegal, sharp as anyone I've ever met, told me point blank about 8 months into it, Tara. They have a favorite kid and it isn't you. And they figured out that you'll keep paying because you need them to love you back. I changed the subject. But I thought about what she said for 3 years straight. My boyfriend at the time, and now fiancé, Marcus, he's an electrician, steady and practical and the least dramatic person I know, would sit with me on Sunday nights while I transferred the money, and he'd just watch me with this look, not accusatory. Sad. Why do you keep doing this to yourself? He'd ask quietly. I never had an answer that satisfied either of us. The guilt was the trap. Growing up, my parents were consistent about one thing. Family takes care of family. It was said at dinner tables, in arguments, in every situation where someone needed something. It was stitched into how I understood myself as a person. If I stopped, I wasn't just cutting off money. I was becoming someone who abandoned her parents. And that felt unsurvivable. So I kept sending it. I told myself they'd stabilize. My dad would find part-time work, something manageable. My mom's health would improve enough that she'd ease back into something. I kept setting invisible deadlines in my head and quietly moving them when nothing changed. What I didn't let myself fully acknowledge was the pattern underneath. How my mom would call not to ask how my shift went, but to mention the water heater was making a noise. How my dad would text on my day off, not to chat, but because there was a copay coming up. How, when I called on Christmas morning the year I was too exhausted to drive down, genuinely sick with a sinus infection, my mom spent the first 5 minutes of the call listing things they needed in January. Not, are you feeling better? Just, here's what's coming up. Marcus saw it. Audra saw it. I kept finding reasons not to. The collapse happened on a Thursday in February. I'd been having intermittent pain on my right side for about a week. The kind of pain you explain away when you work in healthcare because you know too much and also don't have time. It got bad fast, the way those things do. I called in sick at 7 in the morning, which I almost never do. Took myself to the ER at the hospital where I worked, and within 2 hours was being told I had a hemorrhagic ovarian cyst that needed surgical intervention. I was alone in the intake room when they told me. Marcus was at a job site in Evanston. I called him first and he said he'd be there in 45 minutes. Then I called my parents. My dad didn't pick up. My mom answered on the second ring, which was unusual, and before I could get through explaining what the doctor had said, she asked me to hold on and I heard her talking to someone in the background, laughing at something, and then she came back. I told her I was going into surgery, that I was scared, that I didn't know how long I'd be under. There was a pause. Oh, honey. We're actually in Sedona right now. We drove out Tuesday. You know how we've been talking about it. Can Dad call you later tonight? You'll probably be out of surgery by then. I just sat there. The nurses will take good care of you, she added. You work with those people. You know them. That's when I texted her. Because I didn't trust my voice and said, I need you to come. She replied with, we can't really cut the trip short. We just got here. Can't this wait? I put the phone down. A nurse I've worked alongside for 2 years came in to do my pre-op intake and she took one look at my face and squeezed my hand without saying anything. That small gesture, from a colleague, not my mother, is what broke something loose in me. Not crying. Clarity. I'd been sending my parents $1,500 a month for 60 months. $90,000. And lying alone in a hospital bed before surgery, the one time in 5 years I had actually needed them to show up as parents, they were in Sedona on a trip I didn't know they'd taken and couldn't be bothered to come home. Marcus arrived before I went in. He stayed all day. Audra came after her shift ended and sat with him in the waiting room. My parents sent a text around 9 that night that said, hope the surgery went well. We'll call tomorrow. They called 4 days later. I was home by then, recovering, and I let it go to voicemail. My dad's voice on the message was normal, slightly cheerful even, asking how I was doing and mentioning that they'd need the rent money a few days early that month because they had some expenses. I stood in my kitchen in my recovery socks and listened to that message twice. Some expenses. I sat down in my laptop and canceled the automatic transfer I'd had set up for 5 years. Then I started making calls. The first call was to my bank to flag any accounts that still had my parents as authorized users from back when I'd set up the original payment system. There was one old joint savings account I'd forgotten about. I'd opened it with my mom years ago so transfers would be easier. I had it closed that afternoon. The second call was to Audra. She came over that evening with soup she picked up and her legal brain fully engaged. I told her everything. The text messages, the voicemail, the Sedona trip. She didn't say I told you so. She just said, okay, We're going to document all of this. She helped me screenshot every text exchange going back 18 months, the ones where I'd asked about their situation and been deflected. The one where my mom had said, during a conversation about whether I could afford a new car, "You don't really need one. The Civic runs fine." The one where my dad asked for extra money the month I'd mentioned I was trying to save for a small emergency fund, and I'd sent it anyway. The third call, a few days later, was harder. It was to my Uncle Paul, my dad's older brother, the family historian type, who lives outside Indianapolis and who I'd always been close with. I called to fill him in, mostly. But what he told me changed everything. He'd been meaning to reach out, he said. His voice got careful in the way voices do when someone's about to say something significant. He'd been going through his mother's papers. My grandmother, who passed 3 years ago, and had found documents related to her estate, specifically a copy of her will and a letter of instruction she'd left for distribution of her personal assets. My grandmother had set aside $25,000 to be divided equally between me and Weston. My dad was named as the executor of that portion of the estate. Paul had assumed it had been handled. He'd assumed we'd both received it. He was calling, gently and with obvious discomfort, to find out whether we had. I had never received anything. Not a check, not a letter, not a phone call. I called Weston that same evening. He'd gotten his half $12,500 about 2 years ago. He assumed I'd gotten mine. He hadn't thought to ask. I sat with that for a long moment. Weston, who my parents adored, had quietly received his inheritance and had not once, in 2 years, wondered aloud why I hadn't mentioned mine. Otter pulled the estate records the next day. It took her about an hour. My grandmother's account had issued 2 disbursements. Weston's portion went to his address. My portion, $12,500, had been redirected. My dad had filed paperwork listing a different account number. The account it was sent to was in my name, an old account I hadn't used in years and hadn't checked. When Audra helped me track it down, it had been emptied. $12,500, withdrawn in 3 transactions over 2 months, starting a week after the disbursement was processed. My dad had rerouted my inheritance into an account he had access to and spent it. I sat at my kitchen table and read that information 3 times. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I was past shaking. Marcus sat across from me. He'd taken the day off, hadn't told me he was going to, just showed up that morning and said he'd stay. When I showed him the documents, he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said very quietly, "Tara, this is theft." Audra said the same thing, with the addition of, "And we're going to do something about it." The week after I found out about the inheritance, my mom called 4 times. I didn't answer. On the 5th attempt, she sent a text. "I don't know what we did, but this is hurtful. We're your parents." I read it. I put the phone down. I did not reply. Then the tone shifted. A text from an unknown number. "You need to think carefully about what you're doing. There are things we could talk about publicly that you wouldn't want talked about." The threat was vague enough to be almost laughable. I don't have secrets that could hurt me. But the intent was clear. They were trying to scare me back into compliance. I forwarded it to Audra immediately. She said, "Perfect. Keep everything." A few days later, my grandmother's neighbor, a woman in her 70s named Miss Opal, who had known my family for decades and was one of the only people outside my immediate circle who had genuinely loved me without conditions, called to check on me. She'd heard through family channels that there was tension. I told her some of it, the surgery, the Sedona trip, what I'd found about the inheritance. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandmother always worried your daddy would do something like this. She told me once she almost changed the executor. I told her she was being too hard on him." Her voice was heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, baby." She would have been furious. That mattered to me more than I expected. Not as evidence. I already had plenty of that. But as confirmation that what I was experiencing wasn't my imagination and wasn't my fault. My grandmother had seen something true about my father and had hoped she was wrong. Miss Opal said she still had some of my grandmother's letters. handwritten ones, including a letter meant for me that my grandmother had never sent because she died before she could, and that had apparently been sitting in Miss Opal's kitchen drawer for 3 years because she hadn't known how to deliver it. She read it to me over the phone. My grandmother's voice, even filtered through Miss Opal's slower cadence, came through clearly. She wrote that she was proud of me, that she knew it was hard being the quiet one in a loud family, that the money she was leaving was for my future, specifically mine, to use however I needed: school, a home, a cushion, a fresh start. She wrote, "Don't let anyone tell you what your life should cost." I cried for the first time since the hospital. Not from sadness exactly, from something more complicated. Grief for the grandmother I missed, fury at what had been taken, and something that felt, underneath all of it, like being seen. Audra filed a police report covering 3 things: the attempted rerouting of my inheritance, the threatening text from the unknown number, and the evidence we'd compiled about the financial pattern. The detective she spoke to was matter-of-fact about it. "Estate fraud is taken seriously," he told her, "especially when there's documentation." I filed for a civil restraining order covering myself and Marcus. The paperwork required me to document the threatening communication and the pattern of contact I'd received since cutting off the transfers. The judge granted a temporary order within a week. My brother Weston called me around this time. He'd heard, through my parents, presumably, that things had escalated legally. He wasn't angry. He was bewildered, the way people are when a reality they've been insulated from suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. He kept saying, "But they're our parents." The same sentence my mom had texted me, as though the biological fact was a counter-argument to everything else. I told him about the inheritance redirection calmly and completely. He went quiet. Then he said, "Why didn't you just ask me? I would have helped you figure it out." And I understood in that moment that Weston wasn't cruel, he was just comfortable. He'd received his $12,500, assumed everything was fine, and had never needed to look closer because nothing in his life had required him to. He was the golden child, not because he was better, but because he'd never been put in a position where the cost of that favoritism became visible to him. He asked what he could do. I told him the truth. I needed him to give a statement corroborating that he'd received his inheritance and had not known I hadn't received mine. It took him 3 days to decide to do it. But he did. My parents were interviewed by a detective 6 weeks after Audra filed the initial report. I wasn't there. I heard about it through the process. 11 days after that interview, I got a call from a victim's advocate at the county DA's office. My father had been formally charged with 1 count of estate theft and 1 count of wire fraud related to the redirected account access. It wasn't a minor charge. The DA treated it as a financial crime, which it was. I stood in my kitchen again when I got that call. I seemed to make all my major decisions and receive all my major news in that kitchen. And I felt something release in my chest. Not joy. Relief isn't even the right word. More like the feeling of a weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there, finally being set down somewhere outside your body. My mother texted me 3 days after the charges were filed. It was a long text, the longest she'd sent me in years, full of language about family and sacrifice and how she hoped I'd someday understand what they'd been through. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement that my dad had taken money that was mine. There was a line near the end that said, "We needed it more than you did." I read it once. I did not reply. I saved it to the folder Audra had set up for documentation. They lost the Naperville house 4 months later, not because of me, but because without the $1,500 a month and with the legal costs they were managing, the refinanced mortgage caught up with them. I didn't feel vindicated by that. I didn't feel much about it at all. That part of my life had receded to a place where it no longer had the same pull on me. Weston called once more, about 2 months after everything had settled. He'd been doing what I think is the uncomfortable work of reassessing a family narrative he'd been comfortable in. He said, "I think Mom and Dad treated you differently than they treated me for a long time, and I didn't want to see it. And I'm sorry I didn't." It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was honest. It's the first honest conversation about our family I can remember having with him. We're cautious with each other now, not close, but not nothing. With the civil case resolved, I received restitution for the redirected inheritance. Not all of it, but most. Combined with my own savings, Marcus and I bought a condo in Logan Square last spring. It's small, second floor, faces a courtyard with a big oak tree that I can see from the kitchen window. We painted the living room a deep green that I'd had in mind for years and never had a wall to put it on. Miss Opal sent a card when she heard we'd moved in. She enclosed a small photo she'd found among my grandmother's things. Me at about 7 years old, sitting in my grandmother's garden, squinting at the camera in full summer sunlight. I have it on our windowsill. Audra came over for dinner the first week we were in the condo. She brought wine and spent 3 hours making fun of me for how long I waited to cut them off, which is exactly the right way to handle it. Marcus made the table we eat at now. Built it himself over a weekend from reclaimed wood he'd found through work. It's solid and slightly uneven and the most beautiful piece of furniture I own. I think about my grandmother sometimes when I'm sitting at that table. What she wanted for me. What she would think of where I ended up. I think she'd be okay with it. I think she'd say that a life that actually belongs to you is the whole point. The one thing I'd go back and tell myself, if I could, the version of me at 28 wiring that first $1,500 and telling herself it was temporary, is this: love doesn't require you to disappear. Loyalty that only flows one direction isn't loyalty. It's just a system someone built to extract from you. And the moment you recognize the system, you're allowed to step out of it. It took me 5 years and a hospital bed and $90,000 to learn that. I hope it takes you less. If any part of this sounds like your life, if you've been the one who always shows up, who always pays, who keeps waiting for them to finally see you, leave a comment. I read all of them. You're not alone in this, and you're not crazy for feeling exactly the way you do. I've thought a lot about what made me keep sending that money for so long, and I think the honest answer is that I confused obligation with love, and I didn't know how to tell the difference yet. That confusion isn't weakness. It's something that gets built into you slowly, over years, starting when you're young enough that you don't have the language to question it. I was taught that family comes first, and I internalized it so completely that it became my identity. I was the reliable one, the stable one, the one who showed up. And for a long time, I thought that meant I was good. What I didn't understand was that a system had been built around my goodness, quietly, gradually, designed to extract from me while giving almost nothing back. What I know now is that the people doing the extracting didn't suddenly become who they were on the day I was lying in that hospital bed. My parents had been telling me who they were for years. Every flat transactional text, every call that opened with a bill and closed without asking how I was doing. Every time my brother Weston was celebrated and my name was just the one attached to the account number. I wasn't reading those signals clearly because I didn't want to, because reading them clearly would have required me to act on what I saw, and acting on it meant letting go of the version of my family I was still hoping existed. That's the part that took me the longest to work through. Not the anger, not even the financial loss, but the grief of finally accepting that the family I'd been funding wasn't the family I'd been hoping to earn back. You cannot pay your way into being loved by people who have decided you are more useful as a resource than as a person. No amount of $1,500 transfers will change that math. What changed everything wasn't just finding out about the inheritance, though that was its own particular kind of shock. Learning that my father had rerouted money my grandmother had specifically set aside for my future and spent it while I was picking up extra shifts to cover their bills. What changed everything was the sequence, the hospital, the text, "Can't this wait?" The moment when I needed them to be parents and they couldn't even manage a conversation that wasn't about their own comfort. That sequence made everything undeniable in a way I couldn't explain away. And once I stopped explaining it away, things became surprisingly clear. Audra had been telling me the truth for years. Marcus had been watching me hurt myself, and saying so, quietly, without pushing. Miss Opal, who'd known my grandmother, confirmed what I'd already started to understand, that this wasn't new. That people who loved me had seen it before I had, and had waited for me to be ready. The courage to act wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a long series of smaller choices. Closing the account, Making the call, sitting with Audra at my kitchen table, going through 2 years of text messages. Integrity isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just doing the next right thing when you're still exhausted from the last one. What I carry forward from all of it is this: the life I have now. The condo in Logan Square, the green walls, Marcus's table, the photograph of me in my grandmother's garden on the windowsill. None of it would exist if I had kept choosing comfort over honesty. My own comfort and theirs. Every month I sent that money, I was also deferring the version of my life that was actually mine to live. You get to stop. Whatever you've been carrying that isn't yours to carry, you are allowed to set it down. Not because it's easy and not because everyone will understand, but because a life built on what's real will always outlast a life built on what you were afraid to lose.